The Pillars of Hercules is the name that Plato used to describe the boundary markers of Atlantis. According to the text, Atlantis was located not far from this boundary. Over the centuries, the location of the Pillars of Hercules has been disputed by many. The pillars are generally thought of as rock hills in the Strait of Gibraltar in Europe and Mount Aka near Ceuta or Jebel Musain, which lies west of Ceuta in Morocco. Others prefer to think of them as a pair of pillars located outside the shrine. Classical writers often refer to these pillars without specifying their location. The pillar was, in ancient times, identified with the Strait of Sicily, but since Eratosthenes ca. 250 BC, it was moved around the Strait of Gibraltar, reflecting the expansion of Greek maritime knowledge. In addition, the poet Pindar in the third Nemean ode mentions this pillar as a metaphor for the boundaries of geographic knowledge of Greek society, boundaries that are never static. In his dialogue, Plato does not mention the Pillars of Hercules as the hills around the Strait of Gibraltar, the latter were only known recently. In addition, the Egyptian priests also called these boundary markers like the Pillars of Hercules, so they were not referring to the pillars known to the Athenians. In addition, Plato did not call it a pillar, but was a monument, Greek stelas, that was on the border. Hercules is synonymous with Batara Kala because they both have similar properties. Batara Kala and Hercules were the children of the supreme god, either Batara Guru or Zeus, respectively. Their birth is indecent. Kala was born from Batara Guru's uncontrollable lust for Dewi Uma while Hercules was from Zeus's seduction of Alcmene. Batara Kala and Hercules both had an insatiable appetite, and were very violent, brutal and violent throughout their lives. Apparently, Solon translated Kala to Hercules. The author hypothesizes the Pillars of Hercules as a boundary monument decorated with Kala's face, as is often found in Java and Bali. In Timaeus, for some reason, the sea in that part is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a mound of mud in that place, and this is due to the sinking of the island. A mound of mud is the familiar translation of the ancient Greek phrase, Pelo Karta Brachios, written by Plato. Karta Brachios is not good grammar and is not found in any text. Pelos is masculine and is the antecedent of relative pronouns. Kata Brachios supposedly is adverbial. Literal meaning: Pelo is clay, or mud, Karta as very, and Brachios as mound, or rock. Another alternative translation is, there is a large amount of clay in a shallow depth. Rodolfo Lopez, 2011. The author translated Pelo Karta Brachios as coral reef, on the grounds that these sea formations were so rare in the Mediterranean that the Greeks and Egyptians did not have a term for them. The Mediterranean is no longer home to the large coral reefs that flourished 60 million years ago. This is due to changes in climate and oceanography over thousands of years. Today, there are very few species of anthozoan colonies that have the capacity to form coral reefs. In 2010, the exploration ship Nautilus discovered for the first time an area of deep-sea coral reef in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Israel. This area stretches several kilometers, 700 meters below the surface, 30 to 40 km from the coast. In Plato's account, the Fortress of Atlantis was impassable and impregnable in Solon's time, around 600 BC, due to growing coral reefs caused by rising sea levels during the Ice Age, sinking of the island. The present conditions at the sites hypothesized by the authors are that there is a coral reef identified by the sailors as Gosonggia or Annie Florence Reef, a coral reef that is described as being small and rising to the surface at low tide. Coral reefs are diverse underwater ecosystems composed of calcium carbonate structures formed by clumps of coral. Coral reefs are built by small animal colonies that are found in marine waters that contain nutrients. Most coral reefs are formed from corals produced by clustered polyps. These polyps belong to a group of animals known as cnidarians, which also include sea anemones and jellyfish. Unlike sea anemones, coral polyps secrete a hard carbonate outer shell that protects them. Corals grow best in warm, shallow, clear, bright and unsettled waters. Coral reefs begin to form when free-swimming coral larvae then attach to rocks or other hard surfaces submerged along the edges of islands or continents. Growth rates are 0.32 centimeters per year for large corals, and up to 10 centimeters per year for branching corals, so it can take up to 10,000 years to form a coral reef from a cluster of larvae. Barnes, 1987, as cited by NOAA. The Fortress of Atlantis consisted of a hard surface so that coral reefs began to form after being submerged, growing and expanding as is usually found at shallow depths in tropical waters. Underwater exploration will not find the fortress unless an investigation is carried out under the coral reef. The rate of sea level rise during the last ice age was an average of 0.6 centimeters per year. Since the sea water at the author's hypothesized location is warm, the growth rate of coral reefs is higher than the rate of sea level rise. Thus, the vertical growth rate of coral reefs at that location coincides with sea level rise. Orichalcum in Greek consists of the words oros, ros mountain, and chalkos, chalk, sigma, or, meaning, ore from the mountain. We can speculate that the orichalcum Plato was referring to was actually zircon, as this mineral could be excavated from the earth in many parts of the island, or was abundant in southern Kalimantan where the Atlantis plain was hypothesized. This material is really of second value to gold, has a gemstone-like quality, and is known as a diamond clone. Zircon ore requires a process of extraction, refining and heating to produce zircon products that are colorful. Plato mentions that the walls surrounding the temples of Poseidon and Clito were covered and sparkled with the red light of orichalcum. No metal or its alloys are known to be red, so orichalcum is not a metal but probably hyacinth red zircon. Once finished, it sparkled like diamonds, which metal does not, so Plato described it specifically with the words sparkling and luminous. More valuable in those days than anything but gold, Plato compared orichalcum to gold, whereas zircon is from the Persian word zargan, which means golden in color, later changed to jargun, which is meant to be a light-colored zircon, which the Germans later adapted to become zircon. Allegedly, Plato or Solon mistranslated zargan, the gold-colored material, to be orichalcum because there was no such word in ancient Greek. At the end of the Critias, it is explained that every 5 or 6 years alternating, the kings of Atlantis gathered to discuss and make agreements, ending with the offering of many buffalo sacrifices. The custom of offering buffaloes for offerings only exists in Southeast Asia and Southern Central Asia. Of course, Plato did not call it a buffalo, because this animal is only found in the area, but as a similar animal, namely the bull. Let's look at the offerings of buffalo or bulls in Kalimantan on the Kutai inscription. Kutai IV inscription. The Mulawarman, the noble and distinguished king, has given alms 20,000 cows to the Brahmins who are like fire, housed in the Holy Land, named Waprekswara. For a reminder of the king's kindness, this monument was made by the Brahmins who came to this place. The information available was obtained from the Yupa inscription during the sacrificial ceremony. Yupa is a monument made of stone containing writings about King Mulawarman. There are 7 Yupa pieces which are the main source for experts in interpreting the history of the Kutai kingdom. The Yupa was made by the Brahmin for the generosity of King Mulawarman. From one of these Yupa, it is known that the king who ruled the Kutai kingdom at that time was Mulawarman. His name is recorded in the Yupa because he generously donated 20,000 cows to the Brahmins. Apart from menhirs, stone tables and stone statues, the Austronesian megalithic culture in the archipelago also features a terraced pyramid structure consisting of soil and stone, referred to as Pundan Barandik, considered one of the characteristics of the indigenous culture of the archipelago. These structures have been found and scattered throughout the archipelago as far as Polynesia. Among them are found in the Hyang Argapura Mountains, Lebak Sibadug, Basma, Pangawangan, Sisalak and Gunung Padang. The latter is the largest and oldest megalithic site in Southeast Asia, which is 23,000 BC or older, Natawijaja, 2013. Suku and Setho temples in central Java, years still being debated, show elements of Austronesian cultural terraced Pundan which somewhat resemble the pyramids in Central America. The Pundan Barandik is the basic design of the Borobudur temple in central Java. As stated in Critias, the Poseidon and Clito temples were built on the central island, which is a hill, surrounded by water circles. To reach the temple from the innermost circle of water, steps are required on the hillside. This may imply that this temple features an earth and stone stepped pyramid structure, a feature of the indigenous culture of the archipelago known as Pundan Barandik. Plato wrote in Critias chapter 115b, and fruits which have a tough skin, are drinkable, have flesh and can be used as anointing oil. Coconut Cocos nucifera, has nutritious meat, water, coconut milk and oil, is a food ingredient and has been cultivated by people around the world for thousands of years. On many islands, coconut has become a staple food ingredient which is always used in daily cooking. Nearly a third of the world's population depends on coconuts to varying degrees in food and economics. Coconut Cocos nucifera has nutritious meat, water, coconut milk and oil, is a food ingredient and has been cultivated by people around the world for thousands of years. On many islands, coconut has become a staple food ingredient which is always used in daily cooking. Nearly a third of the world's population depends on coconuts to varying degrees in their diet and economy. Among these cultures, coconut has a long and important history. DNA analysis of more than 1,300 coconuts from around the world by Olson et al. 2011 revealed that coconuts were originally cultivated in two separate locations, namely in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Apart from that, coconut genetics were also recorded in the prehistoric trade routes and American colonization. In the Pacific, coconuts were first cultivated in the Southeast Asian islands, namely the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and possibly also in mainland Asia. In the Indian Ocean, perhaps the center of cultivation is the southern suburbs of India, including Sri Lanka, the Maldives and the Lakadewa. Coconuts from the Pacific were introduced to the Indian Ocean several thousand years ago by ancient Austronesians who established trade routes connecting Southeast Asia with Madagascar and the East African coast. Olson et al. 2011. Plato writes in Critias chapter 115b, and the rotten fruits with preservation, which we use as a mouthwash after supper. Tapai or tape is a traditional fermented dessert dish that is original and popular throughout Southeast Asia. It is a sweet or sour alcoholic food and can be used directly as a meal or in traditional recipes. Tapai can be made from various sources of carbohydrates, but usually from cassava, manihot esculenta, rice Oryza sativa, or glutinous rice Oryza sativa glutinosa. Fermentation is carried out by inoculating the carbohydrate source with the microorganisms required in the initial culture, known as yeast, including Aspergillus oryzae, Rhizopus oryzae, Amylomyces reuxi or mucor species, and further including Saccharomyces cerevisiae, Saccharomycopsis fibuliger, Endomycopsis burtoni and others, with bacteria. Tapai is also used to make an alcoholic drink known as arak or brem. Tapai or tape is known under different names, in Indonesia as tape or tapai, Javanese tape, Sunda, West Java puem, Malaysia and Brunei tapai, Thailand khao mak, Cambodia chow or tapai, and the Philippines as tapai or binabarang. Tape ketan is the main dish in Java during Eid al-Fitr. Taprobana is Borneo, not Sri Lanka or Sumatra. Taprobana, Ancient Greek. Taprobana or Taprobane is a historical name for an island in the Indian Ocean. Onesicritus, ca. 360 BC, ca. 290 BC, is the first writer to mention the island of Taprobana. The name was also reported in Europe by Megasthenes, a Greek geographer, around 290 BC, and was later used by Ptolemy in his geographic treatise to identify a relatively large island south of the Asian continent. Although the exact location for the name remains unclear, some scholars consider it an ambiguous interpretation of several islands, including Sumatra and Sri Lanka. This island came to the attention of Europe during Alexander the Great's conquests. The two admirals, Nerchus and Onesicritus, mentioned Taprobana in their reports to Alexander. Nerchus, who had sailed through the southern tip of India, described smelling cinnamon from an island on his way. Megasthenes, Seleucus' ambassador to Chandragupta Maurya's court, reports in more detail. Some Roman cartographers and historians dispute the size, shape and position of Taprobana before Claudius Ptolemy described it as a large island. Taprobana. In Geographia, written around 150 AD, the size of 6 times the Indian subcontinent and straddling the equator. After the fall of Rome, European geography entered a dark age that was more profound than most other disciplines. Like many ancient books and scientific works, especially those in the Library of Alexandria, Ptolemy work was lost for more than 1,000 years among Western scientists. In the late 1400s, after Renaissance scientists studied the writings of Muslim scientists who had stored much of the classical knowledge that had been lost in Western circles, his work was rediscovered and translated into Latin, the language of Western scientists more commonly used at the time. That Geographia became popular once again and more than 40 editions have been printed. In Geographia, Ptolemy explained and gathered all the knowledge of world geography in the Roman Empire from the 2nd century AD. A great effort among scientists of the time, Geographia was written in 8 volumes. The first part deals with the problem of projection, which is depicting a round Earth on a flat paper. The second part includes 7 volumes and consists entirely of the atlas. One problem modern historians have encountered when researching Ptolemy's work is that his works were all hand-copied and then distributed. Many of the maps were not redrawn when copying, and most were copies without images attached. Even books and maps created centuries later based solely on lost descriptions or maps. One source that points to this problem is al-Masdi, an Arab scientist, who wrote around AD 956 and mentions that Ptolemy's Geographia included color maps listing more than 4,530 cities and more than 200 mountains. In Ptolemy's world map, he identified many geographic areas including Taprobana and Area Chersonius. Taprobana has been the subject of debate. Later generations in reading this vague description of the island later clashed over what their predecessors meant. Scientists in the 18th and 19th centuries began to analyze that Ptolemy had confused mention of Sri Lanka and Sumatra, or even the southern tip of the Indian peninsula. In the end, over the centuries it was unsuccessful to establish a single place with the label Taprobana. The name Taprobana has been applied to Sumatra from the 15th century onwards, after a misunderstanding by the Italian explorer Niccolò di Conti. Conti was the first European tourist to distinguish Sri Lanka from Taprobana and identify it as Sumatra, with his emphasis that the island straddles the equator. Subsequently, geographers, historians, cosmographers and other thinkers became involved in controversies regarding its precise identification. Confusion began to arise as to whether the Taprobana described by Mapimandi in the Hereford Atlas, Ebstroff and Catalan and Fra Moro's Planisphere and Martin Behaim's globe as Sri Lanka or Sumatra. Maps such as Cantino, Cavario, and Contarini have misled contemporary readers who further pass on this confusion either through casual implicit discussions or even depicting explicitly on the map, then pass it on naively, with the same level of accuracy as the source, and produce it for live users. Taprobana's geographic peculiarities have attracted the attention of prominent figures in Western history, namely Ramusio, Gosselin, Kant and Cassini, who were interested in the above dilemma, and attempted to solve the Taprobana problem by identifying areas from Sumatra to Madagascar. The Phoenician geographer, historian and humanist Ramusio, relying on anonymous Portuguese information and based on geographic and astronomical data, attempted to match the location and dimensions of Sumatra to the position and size of the island which Iambulus, a Greek merchant, claimed to have discovered. The conclusion is that the Taprobana mentioned by classical writers is Sumatra. Taprobana is also depicted on Sebastian Munster's map in 1580 with the title Sumatra ein großer Insel, Sumatra, a large island. Previous debates have defined and supported Sri Lanka, but Munster's more recent appearance of the map has revived the debate. The Munster map is a good example of the difficulty Renaissance mapmakers had in placing continents on the world map. This shows the confusion of European cartographers in understanding Asian geography. What still baffles everyone is that Ptolemy's size of Taprobana was completely exaggerated when Sri Lanka was referring. In contrast, the Indian subcontinent shown on the map is depicted as much smaller than it actually is. Whereas Sri Lanka at the time of Ptolemy was a well-known island located in the Indian Ocean, and India and its products were equally well known from the pre-Christian era, starting with the Persian occupation of the region up to the Sindh River and following Alexander's conquest, through sea trade. On the other hand, Taprobana, despite its astonishing size, was mentioned by Ptolemy with the trade in elephants and fine spices. Sri Lanka and Sumatra are both known for these two commodities. Sumatra is better known for its spices, but Sri Lanka has a better history of elephants. The intelligence possessed by the Sri Lankan elephant and its ease of use as transportation throughout the Indian subcontinent may have made the preference for Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan elephants began to be exploited on a large scale only after East African elephants dwindled in population. Under the hegemony of the Mongol Empire over Asia, Mongolica Pax, or Mongolian peace, Europe had long enjoyed safe land roads. The Silk Road to India, the Indies, a much larger area than modern India, and China, which had such valuable resources as spices and silk.